Unless you're on Twitter or are one of the alumni of this Open University of the Airwaves, you don't even know that the Twitter files scandal has broken. But you will, that I promise you. Some cynics say nothing will ever come of it because to a man and woman and indeterminate gender, every one of the liberal media elite is caught red-handed in the scandal and therefore will not breathe a word about it. But the Supreme Court of the United States may take a different view. That's the Supreme Court of the United States that we were told was stuffed full of Donald Trump's appointees. What am I talking about if you are just tuning in to this story? Elon Musk paid $44 billion for a $10 billion company called Twitter, on which I have spent a good deal of my time over the last couple of decades nearly. It's worth my while, or at least it was. I had built up a 400,000 following on Twitter with a mixture of sagacity and humour and a bit of personal news about my boys banging in the goals every weekend. And then the previous ownership of Twitter slapped an unwarranted label on me, which effectively accuses me every day, every time a tweet of mine is read by someone, of committing a criminal offence of working for Russian state media, which I do not do and could not do, it being illegal in Britain so to do. The Associated Press show that I made for the American multinational AP, and which they, not me, sold to RT, was of course taken off the air when RT was banned. At that time, I had no such label. This label was applied to me after I no longer had a show on RT. Try explaining that one in court, Mr. Musk. I know that you won't personally be there, but your agents will have to be, unless, of course, this case is settled. But much more serious things happened to other people than happened to me. One of my guests tonight, the military, diplomatic, scientific expert Scott Ritter, was expurgated. He was expunged from Twitter for telling the truth about the Russia-Ukraine war, or at least the truth as he perceived it. Peter Hitchens of the biggest selling newspaper in Britain, the Daily Mail, Mail on Sunday, opined not a couple of hours ago that the Suez Crisis divided Britain. The Vietnam War divided the world. The Iraq War divided the world. But it is not permitted to divide opinion on the Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, a cabinet minister said on television today that Britain's nurses must send Vladimir Putin a clear message by accepting their below inflation wage deal and therefore a cut in their standard of living. The idea that in the Kremlin, Mr. Putin is carefully watching what Britain's nurses settle for in the latest wage round, or that if the nurses take a pay cut, this will be consequential to Vladimir Putin in what way is not explained. Couldn't be explained by the Conservative minister in question, Nadim Zahawi. That's the man that charged the taxpayer to heat the stables in which he kept his racehorses. A billionaire, at least a multi-millionaire, like so many in Rishi Sunak, the billionaire's cabinet. But I digress. People have been purged off Twitter altogether. But what Elon Musk did by publishing Twitter files this week, in the last couple of days, was far more serious than that. It was evidence, clear and incontrovertible, that the 2020 presidential election was stolen for Joe Biden and the Democrats. Incontrovertible in that the emails and the internal messages and chats make absolutely abundantly clear that the company, before Musk took it over, was receiving orders from Democratic Party panjandrums to block people, to remove people, and most crucially, to describe the Hunter Biden laptop story as Russian disinformation, a false claim that was attested to by no less than 51 former senior security and intelligence officials of the American state. But it was not Russian disinformation. Every word on the laptop turned out to be true, as has, too late, been acknowledged by the very newspapers, like the New York Times, which first branded it as Russian disinformation in the first place. So if it was not Russian disinformation, the false allegation that it was American disinformation, and moreover, disinformation that was being spread at the behest of one of the two main candidates in the presidential election. And when you see what was on the laptop, you know exactly why. Because if the information on the laptop had been before the American voters, before Election Day 2020, Joe Biden would have lost. Without a scintilla of doubt, he would have lost. Not because his son is a vile, debased pervert, and all of that is attested to on the laptop, including pictures taken by his own hand of him in sexually compromised situations with crack pipes in his mouth, smoking crack cocaine and cavorting with young women, some of them too young to be cavorting with him. Not for that reason, because Joe Biden could have said, I have an errant son, don't visit the sins of the son on the father. He might have claimed that. But much more seriously on the laptop was the information that Joe Biden, when vice president to Barack Obama, was up to his neck in financial corruption with foreign governments, principally the government of, you've guessed it, the Ukraine. That Joe Biden was the big guy who got a cut of the business being done in Ukraine by Hunter Biden with no qualification other than that he was the son of the Vice President of the United States. I'm talking tens of millions of dollars. And there's the big guy seeded throughout the laptop's contents. And I'm saying here now, Joe Biden can sue me if he likes, that the big guy is him. We know that because we saw the big guy in action on the television, ordering the Ukrainian government to sack their chief prosecutor because he was investigating the malfeasance being indulged in by Burisma, an oil and gas company that was paying unaccountably Hunter Biden $100,000 a month for doing nothing. A crackhead, dishonorably kicked out of the US military, who never worked in oil and gas in his life, was getting $100,000 a month for not showing up at Burisma. And when the chief prosecutor bravely began investigating it, Joe Biden on television warned the Ukrainian government that in the dog days of the Obama administration, he would cost the Ukrainian government $1 billion in American aid unless this chief prosecutor was sacked. The evidence on the laptop was clear, incontrovertible, and would have cost Biden the election. That's why Twitter executives moved decisively into action, and it's all there in black and white. They decided falsely to brand this story as a Russian disinformation project and to expunge any reference to it in the entire 3 weeks before polling day in 2020. They shut down the Twitter account of the New York Post, a grand old newspaper, a legitimate part of the American journalistic landscape. They shut down their Twitter account because they had broken the story about Hunter Biden's laptop. Anyone who referred to it was suspended, shadow banned, blocked, or banned. Every trace of the Hunter Biden laptop story was ruthlessly expunged by named Twitter executives, and they all a lie. Now, of course, Twitter is entitled to publish or not publish anything that it likes, but it is not entitled to conspire with officials of what was, in certain states like Arizona, about which more later, and would soon become, as a result of their activities, the government of the United States of America. That becomes a criminal offense against the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. It becomes a conspiracy to commit a criminal offense against the Constitution of the United States of America. It becomes, dear ladies and gentlemen, an act of treason against the United States. And whilst it's true that the BBC have not breathed a word of Twitter files, or Elongate, as I like to call it, because he's the man that's opened the gates so that we can now all see what the man buns with the man bags in San Francisco were doing in charge of what they laughingly called the public square. Whilst it's true that the BBC, the Guardian, and the New York Times, and the Washington Post have not yet breathed the word of this scandal, this matter will now move into the courts of the United States, and probably, first of all, in Arizona. Arizona, you may recall, was a knife-edge contest where the counting suddenly stopped for many hours in the middle of the night, and where, rather surprisingly, Donald Trump lost the election. Well, it turns out in the new revelations today in the Twittergate files that the high officials of the state of Arizona were literally hourly and certainly daily in touch with officials at Twitter to manipulate in a criminal way the circulation of truthful information, which materially affected the result, even if nothing else did. And nothing else is unlikely to be all that happened in the case of Arizona. We'll be talking to a freedom rider in the United States about that in just a few minutes. But let me turn briefly, as I must, to Ireland, where my heart lies, my mother being herself Irish. Today, I learned that though a neutral country though constitutionally bound to be a neutral country. A constitutional provision that is more honoured in the breach than in the observance, as anyone who's ever been at Shannon Airport already knows, that the Irish state has entered into the Dáil a new bill with one single purpose: the purpose of banning the Chinese company Huawei from the marketplace in the Irish Republic. Now, I don't own a Huawei. I have nothing to do with Huawei. But I've got to ask this question: what did China ever do against Ireland? If the Irish politicians were entering bills which said, we want nothing to do with the United Kingdom because it hangs on to a small part of our country whose reunification we demand, I could understand that. I would think it was diplomatically and politically foolish, but if the Irish wanted to boycott and ban British products, they would have at least a logical case that they could make. They could say, the British held us in bondage for many centuries. They continue to hold on to one of our 4 green fields. We want nothing to do with Britain. I could understand that. But what did China do to you, Ireland? Why are you disfiguring your own face in order to please Joe Biden, the fake Irishman in Washington, and his NATO warmongering alliance, about which I close? I drive up and down the M6, it seems, several times a week. But today, I passed something that I never have seen before. You know the Bob Dylan song, Masters of War? It was ringing in my ears as I came upon a convoy of at least 30 military vehicles that looked like they were serious, that were gleaming, freshly painted, and armed to the teeth. I wondered what on earth this military movement could be. It was a convoy of British nuclear weapons. There they are there. 4 of them in these trucks, guarded, each of them, by multiple military vehicles. And in that truck is the wherewithal to incinerate every single living thing on this island. I just tried to explain to my child when I showed him this picture that there would be nothing left in Britain if an accident or an act of terrorism had intercepted that convoy today. Still less if the real terrorists in charge of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization were to unleash upon the world an exchange of these nuclear weapons in these trucks, which would be answered in full and more than full by the Russian nuclear strike force, with thousands of weapons at their disposal, traveling hypersonically. Those missiles are on their way to Glasgow. Glasgow would be a heap of smoking ash in minutes of the unleashing of this nuclear missile that is there in front of you and is still driving now north up the M6 to Faslane outside Glasgow, where I was once arrested for protesting their existence and tossed into the Greenock jail under a filthy, excrement-smeared blanket. My point is this. It's the one that Peter Hitchens made in his statement earlier today. Suez, Vietnam, Iraq were nothing like as important as the conflict that we are now deliberately entered into over a country whose whereabouts most of us don't know, whose cities none of us can pronounce, none of us can spell. And yet, our entry into this conflict spells the end for me, for you, for my children, for yours, for the children that they might have gone on to have. It spells the end of everything in Europe, in the world. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.